great historian of the 18th century, Ralph Thoresby, after whom the Thoresby Society is named, was a great friend of the Fenton family. They were his cousins, and why he greatly admired them was the fact that they had gone from farmers who were possibly in Hunslet in the 14th century through to being extremely wealthy people who made money out of exploiting the local coal reserves, which were beneath their farmland and beyond. Now, what we have here, this is called Hunslet Vicarage, but this 17th century stone house was actually built by the Fenton family at Woodhouse Hill using the money which they actually made from their exploitation of coal. William Fenton, who was born round about 1607 and leads to 1675, was also one of the wealthiest cloth merchants in the parish and was one of the principal burgesses of Leeds Corporation by 1654. And he also served as alderman from 1658 to 60. So this was his house. Even though he was a staunch Presbyterian, he also administered the new Chapel of Ease at Hunslet, along with his neighbour and fellow alderman, Robert Brooke. Now, Ralph Thoresby regularly visited the Fenton family, and he was a particular friend with William's son, Thomas. And on the 11th of June, 1681, he went to visit them at their house because there'd been a freak storm. And what had happened was wheat had rained down on the house. And Ralph Thoresby had his own museum at his house in Kirkgate. And so he went across with his Dutch cousin, Benjamin Milner of Amsterdam, to visit Thomas. And he went into the best chamber inside this house. He noted in his diary, "I gathered up some of the corn that was rained down the chimney." He put, "With my own hands I picked it from the white hearth. It had stained them with drops of blue where it had fallen. It is of a pale red, or a kind of sky colour, and is very pretty. It tastes like common wheat, of which I have 100 corns." And he goes on to wonder what on earth can have changed the character of this. Now, because the Fentons lived at Woodhouse Hill in Hunslet, it was a very remote place in the 17th century. And what happened when Charles II came back to the throne was he was extremely worried about potential revolt amongst the people of the country, and in particular those independent Presbyterians who had very much supported the Commonwealth. And so a series of acts were passed, the Act of Conformity, the Conventicle Act and the 5 Mile Act, which effectively constrained the movement of Presbyterians like the Fentons and Thoresby. Their ministers, like Thomas Hawksworth of Hunslet Chapel and Mr. Sharp of Mill Hill Chapel, were no longer allowed to have services. And so these Presbyterians decided that the Fentons' house was the perfect place to meet for clandestine worship. Now, unfortunately, somebody within the area reported them to the local magistrates. And what happened was, in 1683, Ralph Thoresby received a summons to appear at the sessions for being present at a factious and seditious conventicle at Mr. Fenton's house in Hunslet. Fortunately, Ralph could afford legal support, and his two counsel, Whitton and Atkinson, skillfully ensured that the case against him collapsed. But nevertheless, it really was a worrying time for him. He also went there to drink, and Ralph, we always have this image of Ralph Thoresby as a rather sober gentleman, and he writes in his diary of the 2nd of December 1680, "Afternoon with some company, went for usual ceremony of going to drink at cousin Fenton's, where I stayed late enough, though not so late at some, being resolute against drinking, having observed the bad consequences of it. Yet 14 years later, on the 7th of November 1694, he dined there with Dr. Manlove and Mr. Whittaker, and with other good friends at cousin Fenton's house, where I enjoyed good company until evening. But then the spirit revived, which, in my poor judgment, is bitter and uncharitable. Lord, pity, pardon, and teachers. He'd obviously drunk far too much. What happened at this house, though, was that the Fentons really outgrew it. They became far too wealthy for it. And at one time, it became leased by the people of Hunslet for their vicar before a purpose-built vicarage was constructed. And hence you see it referred to in this lantern slide as the Hunslet Vicarage.